Hello, my name is Arjan van Doren, and in this short video, I would like to introduce a course to you called Intercultural Communication for Experts. This is an online course that I've developed in cooperation with the Royal Tropical Institute, and it's a course that's available to anyone, anywhere in the world that wants to deepen their knowledge about this field. So before I tell you more about the course, a little of an introduction about myself. So I've worked for a very long time in this institute in Amsterdam known as the Royal Tropical Institute, which is a knowledge center for international and intercultural cooperation. I worked at the training and consultancy branch of the institute where we helped organizations deal with any kind of question about working in a multicultural or intercultural context. Over time, I also became what I guess you could call the institute's linking pin with the academic world, and I started to do research and publish myself, which eventually led to this book called Diversity, Competence, Cultures Don't Meet, People Do, that I published together with Dr. Edwin Hoffman in 2018. Afterwards, I ventured more towards academia and I started lecturing at universities, mainly at this university in Gothenburg, Sweden, where I lectured in an international master's in communications program. So I guess you could say that what I do is trying to bridge theory and practice in this field, where either I'm trying to draw out the practical implications of certain theories or even academic debates, or I'm trying to find studies or theories that help to explain certain things that we might observe that happen in practice. And exactly this is also a bit the kind of process that I'm trying to create in our course, where we're trying to connect theory with practice. Now, just to be clear, what do we actually mean by intercultural communication, often abbreviated by ICC? Basically, intercultural communication is a field of study and practice where we focus on the interaction between people that are members of different cultural groups. This is different from, for example, anthropology, where there is a focus on basically the communication and interaction within such groups. And it's also different from psychology or approaches to interpersonal communication that focus on people as individuals that somehow interact and meet and exchange. So here we try to understand interaction of individuals by the members of the groups that they are, by the groups that they're basically members of. And I think an interesting note there is that traditionally many of the theories and studies in this field have assumed that such interactions happen mainly when people traveled from one part of the world to the other, often to live in this other part of the world. And this obviously still happens, and many of these studies are still relevant, but at the same time, I think it's relevant to say that we often live in a very different context where people don't necessarily need to travel to meet people with different ethnic, religious, or national backgrounds than themselves. So this is a situation that many leading researchers have called super diversity. And it doesn't mean super in the qualitative sense that it's super good, but it's super complex with people of a multitude of different communities, with huge differences between them, but also within them, basically meet and cooperate at work, at school, in neighborhoods, etc., and need to navigate their interactions somehow. And I think this is the situation that we mainly face in today's world, which is not to say that the first part is no longer relevant, but even when people move from one part of the world to the other, they often start to work for organizations with people of all kind of different backgrounds present. Um, so we'll have attention from both these kind of situations in the course, but I think merits slightly different theoretical approaches as well. But we'll mainly be looking at it from the prism of that this is the world that we now inhabit. Now you might wonder, what kind of course is this then? So what I'd like to say is this is not your average competence building course. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I teach those courses myself as well. But this is more of a deep dive into the field where it's not necessarily up to me to give you exact answers, but I'm trying to give you ideas, notions, discussions, theories that hopefully help you find your own answers. And I'm happy to share the answers that have been helpful and work for me if they are helpful for you as well. But the main aim is to present you with a body of knowledge and the connection to practice that helps you as a lecturer, a trainer, an expert, or a practitioner to find the answers that work for you. This is also closely related to a certain approach to learning that we take in this course. So, one assumption here is that intercultural learning mostly resembles what in the literature is known as a transformative learning process. Defined by Meserov, who is a bit the father of this theory, as the expansion of consciousness through the transformation of basic worldview and specific capacities of the self. This is different from, for example, a more instrumental approach to learning, where we assume that when people learn a certain skill, a method, a technique, or even a trick, that this helps them solve their problems in practice. Sometimes this can be a helpful way to look at things, but I think when it comes to intercultural learning, I prefer to see it as a transformative process because I don't think there is one method, one technique, or one tool that solves all your problems. But I do think that learning about these things, opening yourself up to different perceptions, different interpretations, different scenarios, helps you to build a new relation, basically, a different, more complex relation to the kind of situations that we're talking about, which in turn help you to find new interpretations, new hypotheses, new approaches, even new definitions of the problem itself. Maybe you'll decide that what you thought was a problem wasn't even a problem to begin with. Now, this is the backdrop of the learning process that we're hoping to create in the course. But I would also encourage you to maybe think of your own practice to see if this is a helpful way of looking at your own teaching, training, or whatever it is that you're doing in your daily practice. Now, another interesting note is, I think, is to think about the academic field and think about which kind of studies do we build on in this course and how do we see these kinds of studies? How do we see knowledge? What kind of knowledge are we using? And this might be reminiscent of your own time in college in some way, but then see it as a reminder. And I'm trying to look at it through the prism of our course. So in social science, there are studies that we call positivist. And this means that we assume that social scientific research can uncover a kind of underlying truth or reality or structure that can help us understand and even predict social behavior in our reality. You see these kind of studies very often in intercultural studies when people have tried to come up with typologies or dimensions or even scores of different cultures that help them compare and even predict behavior. And I have to say that we'll take a relatively critical position to these kind of studies in our course, but at the same time, gladly use them to find indications, to do self reflection, to build hypotheses, to build scenarios, as long as we keep, I think, the right critical distance to them, I think they can be incredibly helpful. There's a different perspective, they're just known as the constructivist or interpretative perspective, which doesn't assume that there is some kind of underlying reality in the social world that we can really uncover, but that by looking at people's own interpretations and meaning making, that this is very useful to its own end. Because by learning about how people make sense of things, by understanding how people give meaning to things, we can also come to approaches to influence this in a positive way, in the direction that we want to. This is, I think, the maybe dominant way through which we'll be looking at situations in our course. Then there is another paradigm in social science, which is mainly the critical paradigm that doesn't really produce knowledge by itself as the other two paradigms do, but it's a position where we criticize the knowledge production in society or even in science. And we critically look at it to see how that might create problems of its own. How that, for example, could contribute to create or at least reproduce power inequalities in a society. So this is a bit of a new turn in the intercultural field, which I think is essential and very important because it helps us to look critically at the pitfalls and challenges that we ourselves might be creating. So even when we're trying to, let's say, do the right thing by defining things in a certain way, by approaching things in a certain way, we might actually be contradicting the goals that we're actually ourselves trying to achieve. So this creates important warnings for us, where what I would aim to do in the course is at least is not stop at the warning, but then also think what is then left under the bottom line of this critique and what could an alternative position then look like. There are also different academic disciplines that we'll be basing ourselves on in the course. Now, obviously, a lot of our sources will come from what we call intercultural and cross-cultural studies, which is not really a discipline, but more a focus area where people from different disciplines look at. Yet, many of these studies, of course, are very relevant and interesting to our goals. In addition, we might make use of studies more in the realm of sociology and more overall social science, where I think those are very helpful to kind of zoom out and question ourselves what it is that we're actually looking at and what do overall general global or societal developments, how do those impact intercultural interactions? If we think, for example, of globalization or migration or the rise of the extreme right or polarization in society, how does that affect intercultural interactions that we might want to understand or improve? We'll also look at studies from social psychology that I think are very helpful to understand the dynamics between different groups. How do people relate to people if they are part of another group? How do people build certain perceptions, biases, or even prejudices of people that are different from them? This is where social psychology very much comes into. We'll also lean a little bit on more general communication studies to look at basically dynamics in interpersonal situations more generally and how those play out more specifically in intercultural settings. And last but not least, we'll even venture out a little bit to the realm of ethics and political philosophy, mainly to take a closer look at ethical dilemmas, where people in intercultural situations can feel that other people's ideas and behaviors sometimes deeply violate their own beliefs and convictions. And those are potentially the most challenging situations to deal with. And we'll turn to these kind of disciplines to look for arguments or lines of reasoning that might be helpful in those kind of situations. Now, you might be wondering what exactly are the sessions about in our course. So here's a quick reminder. Our first session will look at culture and intercultural interaction more generally. So this is where we lay the basis of an understanding of the subject matter, of what actually culture means, how do we define it, and why do we define it in that way, and how does it suit our aims and goals, and what are some of the challenges in doing that, and how do we then understand what actually constitutes an intercultural interaction. We'll then turn our attention to values, worldviews, and communication styles to make some kind of understanding of the kind of differences that can come into play in intercultural situations. The kind of different beliefs and habits and ways of communicating might be different between individual people from different groups. We'll then look more at the process and the background of things by focusing on identity, power, and language. So, how do people approach people that are different from them? How do they view them? How do processes of identity come into play? Power structures in the background. And how does language shape the way that we communicate about these kind of things? As I mentioned before, there is this challenge of potential ethical dilemmas. And this is the session where I'd like to focus on that, where we also position certain aspects of dialogue as probably the most sustainable way of dealing with these kind of challenges. And last but not least, you could say that the program has a sort of a funnel shape, an upside down pyramid, where we start very broad and we become more specific along the way, where the top-point model is our approach, as argued for in the book, to try to understand and intervene in specific situations. And we'll go into more depth in this session about the model. Now, something about the approach to our sessions as such. So, how do we kind of use our time in our sessions? So, obviously, there will be some short lectures based on academic theory and academic discussions that will try to keep as interactive as possible, where I might be asking you questions actively, and if I don't, you are dearly invited to ask those questions yourself and interrupt me. We'll also explicitly take the time for small group discussions and do some exercises that might be suitable for your own lectures or your own training sessions. Um, this is not a kind of certification course where I hand over certain exercises with detailed instructions. That will be a different kind of course. Yet, I will try to show you exercises in every session that relate to the subject matter that we're discussing, and that could be a direct or indirect inspiration for you to use in your own work. At the same time, we'll also be focusing very much on exchange and mutual learning, since in our groups we will have participants with a very varied and deep experience and background when it comes to this field, I think at least the most learning will come, at least as much learning will come from your own mutual exchanges, will come from learning from the course content. So you will also be put in touch with a network of people with a very deep and profound interest in this field. The course will serve as a standalone, so you should be able to follow suit just by attending the different sessions that we have. Having said that, there is an addition. There is a course book, diversity, competence, cultures don't meet people do, that you are strongly recommended to read as well while going through the course. Where again, this is not mandatory, but it will provide, I guess, much more depth and also a much broader understanding of the topics that we're talking about if you read that book on the side. In addition, we will provide certain academic articles that relate to the subject matter. If you really want to get more into the nitty gritty of the research or the academic discussions about things, we'll provide those too. Last but not least, there will be a message board and a database for reflection in between the sessions where you can exchange thoughts with your classmates and with me, and we can keep the discussion lively and going between the sessions so that learning can continue afterwards and in between. And there will be a database as well where you find all the articles and background information that might be relevant to the different sessions. I hope that this has given you a sufficient introduction to the course, whether you've already enrolled and are watching this before the course starts or because you're just curious whether this course could be something for you. However, if you want more information, you can approach me based on these contact data, either via email or I'm also quite active on LinkedIn where you can find me. And if you want to find more information about the course, please find it here through this URL, www.kit.nl/intercultural communication for experts. Thanks for your attention, and I hope to see you soon